Dr. Hardt, it's good to see you.
Wonderful to see you again.
All the way from Dubai. Where are you in the world?
Sedona, Arizona.
Fantastic. I've been waiting to do my Delta training, but I can't travel at the moment, so maybe one day.
You know, we have one of our Diamond Dozen members in South Africa who has done 5 of his 12 trainings, and he wanted to come next month and do some more trainings. He was not allowed to leave South Africa, couldn't travel.
Gosh. Well, they say everything in perfect timing. And congratulations on the 2nd summit of global consciousness. I can't believe it's nearly been a year since the last one. What kind of feedback did you hear? What was the impact?
It was pretty amazing. It doubled the number of people in the Biocybernaut community. It was absolutely incredible.
Wow.
The speakers, of course, are eager to come back. Tony Robbins will be speaking again. So will Prince Alfred von Liechtenstein. I'm not sure whether Samie herself will make it or if she's going to have one of her understudies, but she's definitely in. And I think Jack Canfield is so engrossed in writing some books under contract that he won't be able to break away to do this, but pretty much everyone else is, and new speakers.
Amazing. It was remarkable. I had not connected with Her Holiness Samie before, but as she was speaking, she just started to channel my energy, and we've stayed connected ever since. And you obviously is a master on earth.
He is, yeah.
Incredible.
Well, I'll tell you a Samie story.
Tell me.
Okay, I had gone to Germany in December to lead the Christmas training. We were booked out for 3 months solid. And so we started on the 26th of December. At one point, the police came by and wanted to shut us down. And I explained what we were doing. They left. They came back, a different group came back the next day. And I showed them what we were doing and they understood and they left. And the 3rd day, which was December 30th, I opened the door and there were 8 police people, 4 policemen and 4 policewomen. And they were very polite, but they said, we are authorized to drag the people out of the chambers unless you, I said, well, that would be a little disruptive. Let's shut down in a more orderly manner. And so we did. It was day 5 of the training. And I wasn't sure what to do. And I think it was January 1, and Samie broke what was planned to be like a 1-month silence. 10 days in, she said, Jim, you've got to get out of Germany immediately. She was in Florida, I was in Bavaria. And so she came out of this silence retreat to call me and said, you've got to get out of Germany immediately. So the next morning, I was at the Zurich airport, and as I was checking in, the lady said, well, you're really lucky that you're traveling today because tomorrow or the next day, we're shutting down all flights to North America.
Wow.
Yes. So thank you, Samie.
Big time thank you, Samie. It was just remarkable. I noticed she was speaking, then all of a sudden, there was a shift in her eyes and she started to channel something directly and then would continue again. And yeah, it's been incredible to stay connected to her and some of the other speakers. So thank you for having us back. I wanted to have this fireside chat with you via Zoom, just to catch up because it's been a couple of years.
Yes.
Have you noticed that more and more CEOs and business leaders are stepping into this space? I sense that a few years ago, there might have been a perception that it was a bit fluffy. And now this shift, it seems like there's all these disasters in the world, but consciousness is rising, we are evolving. And I'm noticing more and more people who lead businesses, heads of state, they're stepping into this space. What are you hearing and seeing?
We have been blessed, going way back into the 80s, to be privileged to train the most forward-looking leaders in the world. it was probably 89 or 90 when I trained the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation. And he was a remarkable man and absolutely loved the training. He had a family member do the training with him. And he came by frequently to offer business advice to Biocybernaut. I've also trained a sitting governor. And you know, Prince Alfred von Liechtenstein, whose family owns a country, has done here in the US his Alpha 1, and in my German center in Bavaria, he's done his Alpha 2. And so I've had Middle Eastern royalty, European royalty, heads of government, at least as high as the state level, and CEOs of large companies, prominent people around the world. Tony Robbins has done the training. So yes, it's been a real privilege to work with people at the leading edge of the growth of human consciousness. And that's why it's such a joy to be able to host the Global Consciousness Summit 2.0. And it's going to be at least an annual event, and it's possible that it could ramp up into being every 6 months. We'll have to see how it goes. But it's a joy to bring all these people together and to help coordinate, the messages that they have for humanity, desperately needed information and the emotions, the love, the compassion that, as you know, Samie is emblematic. She exemplifies this, and to be in her presence is for it to get on you. You catch it. It's beautiful.
It really is. I mean, just look at our faces when we speak about her.
Yeah.
And of course, we've been translating your books into different languages. So here we have it in Arabic.
Oh, very nice.
And look who that is.
It's Samie. Oh my God, how wonderful.
Yeah. That was taken in Bavaria.
How nice.
Amazing. I loved on the first training I did, the initial stages were learning how to suppress alpha. Mm-hmm. And I think that initially you want to get into expanding alpha. But one of the lessons I've taken is all the things I did to reduce the tones in order to suppress alpha, I'm now able to recognize in my life that that could form much of what a normal day looks like. So, knowing what doesn't cause alpha is as helpful as knowing what can expand them. Can you tell us a little bit more about how to suppress than how to expand? What's the thinking there?
Everything in the training has at least 3 reasons for being there. Were that not the case, years ago, whatever that was would have been pushed out by some other activity that had 3 or more reasons to be there. Because as you know, we don't lack for things to do. The days are quite full and long. So what are the 3 reasons to do suppression? Well, it turns out that in any physiological learning and in many kinds of mental learning, bidirectional training is more effective. So you learn to do it and you learn to not do it. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say that I have a lot of tension and I come to you as my therapist and I go, oh, Samie, you gotta help me. I'm so tense. And you say, well, doc, all you need to do is relax. I go, I can't even spell that word. What do you mean? And then you say, well, tense, and I go there. And then you say, relax. And then I go back to my normal level of tension. And that gives me the direction. So I know now the direction to go. By going in the wrong direction and then coming back to my baseline, I understand now which of the many thousand doors in the magic theater to go through in order to relax. Okay, so what might be some of the other reasons? Well, it turns out that in suppression, people are often willing to try a wider variety of things than in enhancement. A lot of people come in thinking that, oh, in enhancement, they have to be good. They have to be mellow. They have to be calm. They have to be peaceful. And so we had one woman in training and she was part of the Beyond War movement. She was in the Ending Hunger Project, and she would sit in the chamber for enhancement. And I'm going to move my hands to illustrate the vapidness of her beingness. She didn't move. She would go, oh, world peace.
Yeah.
Ending hunger. And her alpha was going up, little bits by little bit. But there was no passion behind it. It was hollow. So on the third day, at the end of the session, I go into her chamber, and this sweet lady is madder than the proverbial wet hen. And she snaps at me and she goes, I thought you said this alpha was good. And I go, well, dear, what's going on? She said, well, when I thought about bad things, my alpha went up. And I go, really? What did you think about? And she goes, well, I thought of everybody who ever did me dirty in my life. And I brought them in one at a time, and I set them down in front of me, and then I forgave them. And I go, wait a minute, you're doing forgiveness and you think it's a bad thing? And she goes, oh, I never thought of that. Now that was 1985. I had been doing this work since 1971. And this was the first time I had ever heard that forgiveness was useful for alpha.
Oh, wow.
Seminal moment for this lady. It was also a seminal moment for the Biocybernaut training, because from that point on in 1985, I began encouraging people to do forgiveness. And there's been over 7,000 people do the training. And so I've heard a lot of stories. And so in 2008, after having moved the California Training Center to Canada, there was a Russian family that came to Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, to the training. Father, mother, early 20s daughter, and the mother's sister. They had a professional translator. Well, it was beyond the ability of the translator to convey to all four of these people the oral tradition of what had evolved from these thousands of people times 7 for 7 days of the training. There were tens of thousands of stories that I'd heard about forgiveness. And so the Russian translator implored me to write it down. So in the fall of 2008, I wrote down what are now the 14 steps of the Biocybernaut forgiveness method. Now there have been tweaks here and there and a couple of big jumps, but it evolved from alpha suppression, that sweet, vapid lady who got into some
Wow.
by bringing in bad people to try to suppress her alpha, but she was so good in her heart that it just evoked forgiveness. And so that would never have happened without doing alpha suppression.
Amazing.
I said there were 3 reasons. So the third one is that, what's your favorite car, Samie? All time.
BMW X6.
Okay, BMW X6. What color?
Kind of blood red, red.
Okay. And the interior?
Brownie leather.
Brownie leather. Okay, so now pretend that we have arranged to have exactly this car sitting right outside where you live. Right at the door. There it is. It's just been delivered, and it's yours for a week to drive wherever you want. And the keys are hanging on your door. And the car is perfect in every way, everything you would want. The sound system is loaded with all your favorite music. We, checked with your friends and family what we should load. Now, like I said, the car is perfect in every way, except when it was manufactured, they did not build in any brakes. Now, you probably, you might feel the leather. You might even start the engine, rev the engine, but you wouldn't dare drive it anywhere. How can you drive a car without brakes? You can't. Well, alpha suppression are your brakes.
Right.
You don't want to use them very often, but when you need them, boy, they need to be there and they need to work.
Yeah, absolutely. All CEOs, all business leaders, government leaders are looking for more IQ, more innovation, better results. And it was an uncomfortable truth that it was through forgiveness and gratitude, pretty much alone, that I was then able to enhance my alpha. And when I went back for the theta training, it was interesting to see that the amplitude had actually lasted. And so part 3 of my book, Time for Humanity, invites leaders to look at forgiveness and gratitude, because through the work you've done, it's scientifically proven that it's going to get you all the results that humanity are looking for. There was a little bit of resistance, but until the realization was those tones were not getting louder. Okay, I'll do some forgiveness, I'll have more gratitude, begrudgingly. And then all of a sudden, the whole room started to fill up with music. Amazing.
It's a pretty easy sell for most people that forgiveness is important. In fact, there was a Gallup poll of Americans at one point. Well, in fact, there used to be fairly regularly Gallup poll would be poll Americans. And this was because George Gallup had a very close friend, Sir John Templeton, a very spiritual man. And while Sir John, who's no longer in a body now, when he was alive, periodically he would go to his friend George Gallup and say, hey, George, why don't you do another forgiveness poll? And so he would. And so I had the privilege of reading the details of one of these. And 80% of Americans, when asked to rate how important forgiveness was, 0, not at all, 1, a little, 2, moderate, 3, quite a bit, and 4, extremely, 80% said forgiveness was extremely important. Let's take the ones who know it's extremely important. Then Gallup asked them, well, can you do it? And 85% of those said no. The ones who know that it's extremely important, 85% said they couldn't do it. He asked them a whole bunch of things that, you know, like oddly, prayer didn't work. Asking God's help in general didn't work. Most people don't know how to do that. There was only one thing that Gallup asked about that was associated. He didn't ask about the Biocybernaut training. He didn't know about it. But of the things Gallup asked about, there was only one thing that was correlated with effective forgiveness, and that was meditative prayer. Okay, well, when you take the adverb meditative and you put it in front of any verb, like meditative walking,
exactly.
Meditative sewing, what do I see? I see increases in alpha waves, okay? Yeah. Basically, George Gallup has told us that you can't have effective forgiveness unless it's under a condition of rising alpha waves. If your alpha waves are in this moment not rising, don't even bother trying to, because it's not going to work. You're wasting your time and energy. So in setting up the Biocybernaut 14-step forgiveness method, I've made sure that you only are doing forgiveness when your alpha is going up. And you know what happens when you're getting whites, you know, then you stop. You go to your judges, you say, have I done all I can do for now? Maybe if they say yes, do more, then you go back and you start over again. But if you've got blues and greens, meaning your alpha is rising, setting new highs, you keep forgiving even if it's epic after epic, because you're taking it deeper and you're doing more healing and you are approaching the divinity more profoundly.
After the training, I spent a summer just writing out to people, asking for their forgiveness, whether somebody had done something right or wrong. And, you know, we don't really understand or believe in those terms. Just that process of me being able to reach out to people in the past and free up some of that energy was so transformative. And I think it's not to judge the other brainwaves, but the consciousness I'm able now to bring of when I'm in a certain brainwave state. And as you say, and then use a certain brainwave state to get a desired result. For example, in theta, I think alpha for me, I'm going to do this with my hands, is kind of up. Whoa. Theta for me is sideways, it's gooey, and I'm going to say muddy, but in a good way. It's sticky. And then delta for me is like landing towards the bottom of the ocean. And just in the seconds before I fall asleep, and in the seconds after I wake up, when I go into theta, I'm able to weed my garden, I say. I'm able to take out all the stuff I don't want and to plant some new seeds just before I sense that envelope between the subconscious and conscious closes again. And then I'm able to start my day with 3 new gratitudes. So that framing allows me to be able to activate what I call my unconscious genie, if you like. But tell me a little bit more about my delta, because you've seen my brainwaves.
Yes.
And I think Google is can be a problem for self-diagnosing. So I have this tremendous amount of delta in a waking state. And when I look on Google, it tells me that's medically a bad thing. Now, Dr. Hardt, I've done the medical tests. We don't see any trauma, brain injury. What does it mean then to have so much delta when I'm awake?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you some delta stories, but also one of my degrees is in physics. My first degree, a Bachelor of Science, was in physics. And so I see the world, if I choose, through the eyes of a physicist. And so I understand atoms and subatomic particles. And well, for example, reality is not solid. It looks solid, feels solid, but it's mostly empty space. Rutherford shown in his experiment where he discovered the atom. Radium was known at the time. It was known that it emitted invisible particles. If you put a piece of radium on a photographic film and came back the next day, even though it was completely in the dark, the film would be exposed because there were invisible particles. And so what Rutherford did, and it was known that dense materials like lead or gold could block these particles. And so he took a block of lead, drilled a hole in it, and then tapped a little piece of radium into the bottom of the hole. And then he had a little cannon that he could aim, and it would shoot these invisible particles out of that hole. It would be absorbed every other direction. And so then he took a very thin sheet of gold foil and put it between that. There was his little, cannon firing these, they were actually alpha particles, helium nuclei, and then the sheet of gold. And then it was discovered that you could visualize these particles by taking a little piece of zinc sulfide and putting it under a microscope, because when these invisible particles hit the zinc sulfide, there'd be a flash of light. And so your microscope and the zinc sulfide, you could move it around, and if it goes flash, flash, flash here, and here it's only flash, 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 you go back here, flash, 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 you could measure the intensity of the beam. And so he has this sheet of gold foil, solid metal, light doesn't go through it, and yet he finds that the beam is almost unimpeded in intensity on the other side of the gold foil. And he moves it around, and so whatever these particles are, they're being, some of them deflected, and he even goes to the backside of the gold foil, and some of these particles, a small number, are hitting something in the metal, gold, and bouncing backwards. And so based on that, he came up with the idea that matter is mostly empty space, and that somewhere in matter are very tiny things that are extremely dense. We now call that the nucleus. So matter is mostly empty space. And so, I see the world that way. And I also see the world as moving particles. Now, many people have heard that there are studies that show that waves of a light can also be viewed as particles of light. The particle is called a photon. And depending on how you do an experiment with light, it either shows up as a wave or a particle. Well, the Italian physicist de Broglie also showed that larger things than photons, like atoms or even molecules, are associated with waves. And a molecule would have a de Broglie wavelength. Well, many people have worn noise-canceling earphones, where you put them on, your jackhammer is running, or you're on a jet plane, and you put them on and it's blissfully silent. Well, how does that happen? Well, the device picks up the incoming signal and broadcasts exact same amplitude, but 180 degrees out of phase, so it just cancels it out. Well, if you do that with the de Broglie waves, you could cause a glass of water to simply disappear. You could cause a lump of iron to disappear because you broadcast that which was 180 degree out of phase. And you could also use that for things to like pop in. And so a physicist would look at a volume of space, whether it's a cubic centimeter or a cubic kilometer or a cubic parsec, would look at it as characterized by a quantum mechanical probability energy density function, which would describe the details of all of the stuff in that space. Mm-hmm. And broadcast 180 degrees out, it just goes away. And so it's not magic, it's just physics. Science. And when I look at, everyone has heard of amazing events happen. Well, it turns out that, now referring to the ability to interfere constructively or destructively with the quantum mechanical probability energy density function of the local universe, that ability is stronger in delta than it is in any other brainwaves. Although when I studied Celtic magic with an archdruid, he said merging is compatible with all states. Mm. So you could do this in beta, you could do it in theta, you could do it in delta, you could do it in gamma, but it's most powerful in my experience when you do it in delta. So people that have a lot of delta, let me tell you a story. I'm in California at my last center there on Martin Avenue, and a guy comes from France and to do the training. His name is Terry. And he has big alpha running around 3,000, and he's got big delta running around 3,000. Now, a lot of people will have a burst. I mean, those who have delta, they'll have a burst of delta, and then maybe later, minutes later, they'll have a burst of delta. No, Terry had both mixed. He was running alpha and delta simultaneously. Now, there's different generators in the brain, so it's not impossible, but it's the case that most people achieve delta by lowering their arousal level. Delta is stage 3 and stage 4 of sleep to most neurologists who haven't heard of Kundalini. And so I made the first scientific presentation of the brainwaves of Kundalini, which were massive delta waves. I was doing 8-channel recordings. The occipitals continued to run modest alpha, and the centrals, C3, C4, temporals, T3, T4, and frontals, F3, F4, burst out into very large delta, 8 to 10 times bigger than the person's alpha. And it would run for 15, 20 seconds, and then it would go away. And when I showed this at a scientific presentation, well, I should tell you how I found it out first. First of all, it was a very interesting man. When he first called, he was in the company of a Zen master whose brainwaves I had recorded before he became a Zen master. He was a student of Suzuki Roshi. I also had Suzuki Roshi's brainwaves. And in this man and in Suzuki Roshi, I saw a very unusual pattern. It was a bimodal coherence pattern of alpha simultaneous coherence with theta. And so it was 30 monks. This is the only one that showed a little of this pattern that was strong in the Zen master, Suzuki Roshi. So as a scientist, I know that 1 out of 20 is statistical significant. This was 1 out of 30. I didn't know what it meant. But so I've just put the data on the shelf and continued building the technology, analyzing data. 7 years later, Suzuki Roshi died. It was a conscious passing with like 45 people in the room. Like next Thursday, I'm leaving my body, come on by. Mm-hmm. As he died, he gave transmission to this guy. People in the room felt something leave the dying Zen master and go to this new guy. Now, it caused a little scandal in the Zen community. It's like, oh, why would Roshi, give transmission to that person? Well,
spiritual ego.
There wasn't anybody else who could contain the energy that he was about to drop when he left his body. There's only one. Both of these people have now passed. So we can talk about them a little bit more freely. But anyway, this guy, John, who first demonstration, was in the company of this Zen master who got transmission from Suzuki Roshi. So he was hanging out with good people. And he did come for training. He was a small bird-like man, self-effacing to an extraordinary degree. In a crowd of 2, you wouldn't notice him. And but then I find out he's on a 3-year paid leave of absence from IBM. I'm going, what does this mouse of a man have that IBM is? And the other thing was 3-year leave of absence, no written requirement to go back. They were just hoping that he would come back. What does this guy have that IBM wants so badly? They're willing to give him a 3-year leave of absence and just hope he'll come back. I didn't know. But on the 3rd day of his alpha training, we see these big delta waves going across his head, 6 channels at a time. And at the end, that was back in the days when we wrote paper polygraphs, ink writing. And so I'm flipping at the end of the day, I'm flipping through the pages and go, what's this? I've never seen this. And you go, I don't know. Next one, what's this? I don't know. And so he leaves. And I say to my assistant, Maureen, lab assistant, we have to get to the bottom of this. Now, the chamber that he was using, it's chamber 1, had 16 speakers on the walls, 4 on each of the walls. And he was doing alpha 1, so he was only getting sounds from the front 4 speakers. And I said, we're going to wire up his delta waves to the side and the back speakers at the same volume as his alpha. So if he ever does that again, these speakers are going to boom out.
Wow.
Back. And at the end of the day, when I say, what was that? He's not going to be able to say, I don't know. So day 4 comes and we tell him what we're going to do. And so now if you get booming out of these speakers, that's this delta. And so it happens. Chamber's rocking. It's got 3 800-pound plates in the floor. This is a big, heavy chamber, a Faraday cage, and it's bouncing around from all this. And at the end of the day, I open the door and I go in. We're doing an interview, and the video camera's in, but stereo audio. I give him his mic and I go, well, what was it? And he goes, well, what was what? Well, when all those speakers were booming. Oh, he says, oh, well, that was when the Kundalini was coming up. I go, Kundalini, you have Kundalini, why didn't you tell me? I didn't think you'd know what it was, and I didn't think it was that important. So I had discovered the scientific signature of Kundalini. Now, I did find out more of what this guy's job was. And this becomes very important because it talks about the manifesting power of Delta. He began his career as a mid-level clerk at IBM in Marseille, France. And one hot summer day, there was a horrific traffic jam. 6 hours, the center of Marseille was clogged. And the French, they blow their horns continuously until the battery runs down. And then they get out and swear and fight and, whatever. And so in the cacophony and the heat, this guy, John, had his first ever out-of-body experience. He's flying around over this jammed up city center with all the honking and the yelling and the swearing. And he's swooping down and stopping fights in this state. And so eventually the tow trucks came, pulled cars away, and 6 hours to clear the traffic jam. Well, the next day, John's back at work. He's a mid-level clerk in Marseille, France. Well, I don't know exactly how it happened, but I have to credit his managers at IBM because they suddenly give John a new job. What his job is, let's say IBM wants to open a new plant in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to make a certain product line. So they send a highly paid team of experts there to survey the territory, find available land, making sure that there's roads and transportation, there's water and power, there's city centers, population centers for workers. And so they come up with a selection of plots of land. Then they leave, and another highly paid team of people goes in, and they buy land. Now, they may have to do bribes under the table with officials or whatever, but they buy a plot of land. Then they leave, and then another highly paid team of people come in, and they negotiate with the construction companies for the construction of this new facility. Some of them stay behind to monitor the construction to make sure the contractor doesn't cheat and put in 1/8-inch steel where 1/4-inch steel was specified. And so near the end of the construction, another highly paid team of experts from IBM comes, and they put ads in the paper and they start recruiting workers. Toward the end of that period, a smaller team comes in and they hire the managers. And at the end of this extremely complicated, long drawn out, expensive project, expensive in time and money, here's the completed plant, workers, raw materials, power, water go in, crunch, crunch, crunch. Product goes out the front door and IBM goes ka-ching. Well, Somehow IBM found out they could dispense with all those highly paid teams of experts, which produced results over budget in time and money always. And all they had to do was send John. And John would do everything. And it was way under budget in time and way under budget in money. So when John said to his manager, I'm quitting, the manager freaked out and said, you can't quit. So, quitting. And he goes, well, you probably just need a leave of absence. We'll give you a year's leave of absence. No, I'm quitting. 2 years. No, I'm quitting. 3 years. No, I'm quitting. Manager's now desperate. He goes, 3 years and you don't have to promise to come back.
Okay.
And that's where he was. He was on this 3-year paid leave of absence from IBM. And that was the job that he'd left behind. I didn't put it together until a bit later. You know, I'll tell that story in a moment. But before that, when I presented his brainwaves at the Rob Call's Winter Brain Conference, which used to alternate between Key West and Palm Springs, I think, annually, sometime in the winter. Future Health was his company. I presented this. It was the first time that conscious delta waves had been shown to the scientific community, and they did the Kundalini. The recordings were made in 1988, it's probably early 90s when I made the presentation. Well, at the end of my talk, Gary Schwartz came up to me. You know, he's a very famous psychologist, Harvard, Yale. Then I think he went to Arizona State University and studying communication with the dead, kind of like Raymond Moody or something. Anyway, Gary said, he took me aside, whispering in my ear. He said, when I was at Harvard, I saw brainwaves very similar to that. I go, really? Tell me the story.
Wow.
Well, the student came in, male student, and he seemed kind of agitated, and he insisted that I measure his brainwaves. He was practicing something called Kundalini Yoga, Gary said. Well, Gary somehow felt compelled by the guy's insistence. And so Gary knew enough about the neurology department. He took him down there. He knew how to put on electrodes, run a polygraph, and he ran a polygraph recording. And he said that he found brainwaves very similar to what I had just shown the world. Now, Gary knew enough, just like Google knows enough, to be freaked out about this. And so he went to one of his buddies in the neurology department to go like, well, what is this? And the neurology professor freaked out and said, don't ever let him do that on university property again. But could I keep the record because I want to show it to some of my colleagues? And then Gary said he promptly lost the big chunk of polygraph paper, which Gary added is what science often does with anomalous data. I wasn't the only one to find this. I was just the first to bring it to public attention because the neurology professor suppressed the data. He was too freaked out by it. How did I figure out later how John was able to do this for IBM? That training center closed. It was part of Agnew State Hospital when I was part of UCSF. And now Foster Gamble and I had formed a company called Mind Center. And it was using the Biocybernaut technology. And Foster was bringing in people that he knew, people of influence. And we had a center in Palo Alto, where for the first time we were offering theta trainings. I was reluctant for a while to offer theta trainings in that protocol because, well, I'll tell you a story. I said, Foster, you want me to offer theta trainings? He goes, yes. I said, okay, well, you have to do a theta training first. He goes, fine, I'd love to. I said, and I'm going to follow you home every night after your training. He goes, I thought, you'll find out. So day one's fine, day two's fine. On day three, we drive out of East Palo Alto, cross 101, taking surface streets. He lives in Woodside at the time. And he comes to a traffic light. It turns red. He stops. The light turned green. He continued to sit there. The light turned red. He continued to sit there. Light turned green. He continued to sit there. Light turned red. He continued to sit. It changed red and green 3 times before the next time, I think the 4th time it turned green, he took off at normal speed and drove home. Had no idea this had happened. And so what we would nowadays, our theta protocols are so long, and we have very lengthy debriefings and dinner after that. So that's not an issue. But at Mind Center, what we would do for theta trainings is we would confiscate their keys. And then when they were done with their training, I would inspect their pupils. And if the pupils were too dilated, we would ask them to take off their shoes and socks and go walk in the moist grass outside the building.
Just to ground them again.
To ground them again, absolutely. And then they'd come back and I'd look in their pupils and maybe send them out for another walk in the wet grass. And at some point I would give them their keys. I would drive home, and we didn't have any, shall we say, incidents with that procedure. So there we were in Palo Alto doing theta training. So we had 4 chambers, and I was leading a theta training. There were 3 people in the training. And I said to the techs, I want to do a theta tune-up. So please put some electrodes on me. And during enhancement, I will lie in my theta chair and I will do theta. Well, on day 7 of that theta training, I had my first ever Delta awakening. Now I had done 7 years of the Yogananda meditation. So I was quite experienced in meditation, and probably tens of thousands of hours of brainwave feedback training with my own technology. And so I'm lying there in this chair, and this energy comes up my spine, and it is so incredibly powerful. If you've ever seen firemen with a high pressure hose fighting a high-rise fire, it takes 3 strong men to hold the nozzle. And if they should happen to drop it, it flips around like this giant snake, knocking over cars and whatever because of all the pressure until they can shut the pressure off. Well, that pressure was rushing up through me, and everything that was me, name, identity, career, it was pushed to the far outer edges as this energy just went through me like that. I could not tell you how I got through and the technician on duty was alert enough to recognize something was going on. So he flipped the paper polygraph into high speed. Normally we run at 10 millimeters a second. The fastest that they would go 60. It was like the paper was shooting out like that. And so we were able to accurately record the frequency. It was 1.25 hertz, which is what we call low delta. The dividing line is 0 to 2 is low and 2 to 4 is high delta. And the pens clip, there are mechanical stops. Taking a French curve, we could extend the arcs of the curves up till they met, and we were able to estimate that the energy was over 30,000. Now, the energy of yours that I saw were close to 20. I think they were like 18,000 at the peak. So you know what that feels like. And so somehow I got through the training, and I drove home to my home in San Francisco. I had 2 roommates there, and they both love books and records. And I had promised one of them, Tom, that we would go to the Hong Kong restaurant the next day. It was our favorite Chinese restaurant. It's on Church Street near Market. But it was dangerous for me to go there because a couple doors down was the Art of Art used bookstore. And I had this book buying habit, which went all the way back to, in 2nd grade, I had measles. It settled in my eyes and it made me nearsighted. I've worn glasses ever since 2nd grade. And my father was worried about my eyes, so he put a strict limit of 24 books, 24 books. I could not read more than that per week. So I'd come home from the library with bags. He'd count the books to make sure there were not too many. But of course, every day after school, I would cheat. I would go to the library and I would read the unauthorized books. And so I had this habit of buying and reading lots of books. Well, now I was running Mind Center, I was running Biocybernaut, and I had a large university research project. And I was working 18 hours a day and then trying to go to the gym for a few hours. And I just didn't have any time to read books. So I go, Tom, I can't go. I just can't buy another book. He said, well, you could just look. Okay. So the books were not marked with prices. They had barcodes. And I'm walking down, oh, this is interesting. I'll ask how much, oh, this is like overloaded with books. And I say, Tom, I got to go, find out which one of these I'm going to buy. So we go up to the counter. I dump the books on the counter, and Tom distracts me with a question. And the guy at the counter just takes the books and he's running them through the scanner. And then he interrupts me and he says, well, that'll be, and he mentioned some amount of money. And I go, I'm like startled. I go, well, I wasn't planning to buy any. I mean, maybe one. And then I had this shiver run through me. And I go, well, if you give them to me for, and I threw out some number, I'll buy all of them. And there was a shiver ran through him, and he goes, okay. I gave him my credit card, and he rang it up. 2 big shopping bags of books. I go outside. I'm waiting for Tom. Tom comes out and he goes, how'd you do that? I go, what do you mean? How did you do that? Tom, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, that was the owner. He never gives anybody any discount. I saw you. You got all those books for less than the price of the cheapest one. How did you do it? Oh.
Delta.
Now I understood how John had done what he was doing for IBM. And I also knew why he quit and why he would never go back to do that again, because he was using the power of his delta to override the dishonesty, the larceny, the cheating, the lying of all of the people that would try to impede or take a bigger piece than was fair of the IBM construction project. And one definition of evil is to override another person's will. And so John was never going to go back and do that for IBM again, even though compelling people to be honest and to be truthful might not be thought to be such a bad thing, but it messes with their free will. If they want to be dishonest, lie, cheat, and steal, you can ask them not to, but you may not, unless you're willing to do evil, you may not compel them to be honest. Going back to our Frenchman, who is at my California training center, the one with 3,000 delta mixed with 3,000 alpha simultaneously. So at the end of the first day, when we're flipping through the polygraph records, I ask him, I have this standard question if people are producing delta. I go, are you aware of being able to influence other people? And he like freaks out. He's terrified. And it took a while to calm him down. I, assured him my intent was noble. And then he told me his story. He had been, until quite recently, a high-ranking minister in the French government. And from his position of power, he became aware of plots by the secret government designed to destabilize, undermine democracy and, free elections and all of that stuff. And he used his powers to, well, how did the Scottish poet say it? Their plans went gang after glee. They messed up. They didn't come to fruition. Well, these people are not used to having their plans gang after glee.
Absolutely.
They're used to getting what they want. And so when 11 consecutive plots had failed, they called a high-level review. It's simple at first. They just listed all the names of anybody who knew anything about any of the projects, even if it was just the name. Well, Terry's name was the only name that appeared on all 11 lists. But they knew they had their man. And so with 2 hired assassins and a spokesman, they barged into his office in the French government and said, we're on to you and we are going to kill you. Except that you have one chance to live, which is you join us and use your obvious powers to help us undermine freedom and democracy around the world. And Terry goes, no, there's a third option. And he goes deep into his delta and he comes back and he goes, I will resign from government and you will put all the power of delta in that you will leave me alone. And they
did.
And they trembled out of his office. And he resigned from government. And shortly after that, he comes to Biocybernaut for training. Now, because of his obvious high ethics and his obvious capacity to do delta and alpha simultaneously, he is the only person to whom I've ever given a delta training who didn't previously do multiple alpha and multiple theta trainings. Some of them with me, so I could assess their ethical purity, because we don't want to create any Darth Vaders. You give powers like this to people who still have anger or fear or sadness. Well, let me give you a simple example. When I was in this California center, I had an older couple, married couple, come from Arizona. They were both on their second marriage. The woman had had a very tragic life. She said she did not know what happiness was, literally didn't know. She had delta. And in the course of talking about the Delta, she recounted that back in Arizona, she had become interested in psychic healing, and she'd taken courses. And there was an instance where a lady friend of hers was sick. And so she did a meditation where she sent healing energy to that woman. Well, that night, the woman was rushed to the hospital and nearly died. A week, 10 days later, a different lady friend was ill. And again, she sent healing energy to her, and she was rushed to the hospital and nearly died. When it happened the third time, she goes, maybe I should send healing energy to people, because with the power for Delta, she was connecting to the person, but what was going out over that channel was all that unconscious pain and anger and rage and sorrow, and it was nearly killing the lady friend she was trying to help. So if you have Delta and you haven't cleared, you'd better not try to connect with other people, because you could do, now, maybe if you're of the dark side, maybe that's what you want to do. But that's certainly a Darth Vader type of plan. This is why we do not do Delta trainings except by invitation. When people have demonstrated pretty strongly that they've done ethical cleansing, because you give that power, and you may not want to hurt somebody, but if it's in there in the unconscious, you connect with it.
It's going to convey that power question that my trainer said. So when did you first realize that you were able to alter the fabric of reality? And that was a boom question. But as you say, Dr. Hardt, it's taken years, decades of self-work to be able to clear my stuff in order to bring that time for humanity message to life. Because once you think you've done your work, there's still more to be done. Oh, yes. And then the second you think about somebody, you can manifest like that. I remember coming back from the training, and the next day, I had been looking for this business contact for years, but didn't know how to manifest the person. In a different country, can you imagine? The following day after arriving back, I find myself in an elevator with that person. Perhaps I shouldn't have said what I did. I went, ooh, I've been trying to manifest you for a long time. Beautiful. And we proceeded to freak out, but we were on a panel conversation together. And normally talking about the future of work, it's a meaningful conversation, but something significant was happening in this room. People were getting goosebumps and shivers. At one stage, a panelist welled up. Something was happening. At the end of a conversation, we were speaking to some of the delegates, the attendees, and I could see a lady in my periphery. I was speaking to somebody else, so I turned and said, hi, I'll be with you in just one moment. And I went back to finish the conversation, but something drew me back to that individual. So we started talking, and she said, whereabouts are you from? I said, well, I'm half Arabic, half English. Whereabouts in England? I said, near Manchester. She said, oh, me too. So you know how you zoom in. So I went, well, actually, it's not Manchester, it's Lancashire. Do you know Bolton? She was like, yeah, very well, that's where I'm from. So we zoomed down to, my mum's from Kersley. And she went, me too. I said, well, this is amazing. What brought you here today? She said, I don't normally come to panels. I've just arrived in Dubai, but I was called to this. And you know, whilst you were speaking, I started to well up and I got goosebumps. I went, me too. Anyway, by the end of the conversation, I said, do you have a business card? I would love to keep in touch. She said, no, because I've come to Dubai, I need to register my married name with the authorities. So I'll do it when I've registered, and I'll use my married name instead of my maiden one. I said, perfect. Well, send me a message on LinkedIn, and that way we can stay connected. Later on that afternoon, I was on my laptop. The notification popped in, and she had my mother's last name. And it turns out there was my cousin. Her parents had lost touch with my mum 5 decades before at a panel with a person who had wanted to manifest, if you like, for about 3 or 4 years. It's just remarkable. And when you have that power and the feedback loops are so tight, I say to people, you do your work, because that's the most humble thing that you can do. I have a couple more questions, if I may. One, when I have the third eye in the photograph and there's no filter, but there's some gold and I change color and my aura's going pink and gold, and then this thing appears on my forehead. What is that? If we're not using filters, it was taken at the end of the training. how is it possible then that the halo and the aura becomes captured after the trip? Do you have any insight on the brainwaves and what's being picked up and halo effect?
Time in California, we actually got on tape, we were tape recording then, the brief appearance of a halo over someone's head. It was a training with 5 people in it, and others in the room saw it. It wasn't just me, it wasn't, but when we backed up the tape, we were able to see it. Now, the brainwaves that give rise to a halo, if you were to go to any PhD level electrical engineer and ask them what would happen if you convolve 2 coherent frequencies that are different from each other, then they would say, well, you'll get a torus in phase space, which is a mathematical abstraction. And so when the Zen master and one of his advanced students produced coherent alpha and coherent theta, there would have been over their head a torus in phase space. Now, a torus is a cross-culturally recognized symbol of spiritual advancement and ethical purity. The Buddha is often depicted with a halo. Krishna is often depicted with a halo. Jesus, the apostles, angels, often depicted with, and this is going back, you know, into the 200s, 300s, 400s of, for example, European art, and older in the Buddhist.
It's across cultures.
Yes. So, but it's produced by a certain brainwave pattern. And in 1996, I presented a paper showing the brainwave pattern for, and it was quite an evolution. Remember when I first reported the first paper where I had 30 Zen monks and Suzuki Roshi, and the 2 Roshi and 1 of the advanced had a pattern. Then 7 years later, Roshi dies and gives transmission to that guy, another paper. And then we fast forward at least 10 more years, and I'm at a conference of mainly intelligence officers, spooks of various traditions, NSA, FBI, CIA, and 2,500 people in the audience. It's a very mathematical, dells and curls, and you know, I know what they're talking about, but it's like
maths overload.
And then Dr. Arnold Mandel was introduced, and I knew this was going to be different because he was a math professor, but he had resigned as the chairman of the psychiatry department at UC Davis. Power, prestige. I mean, psychiatrists get to tell what normal is. They define what is normal. And he gave all that up because he loved math so much. So I go, this is going to be very interesting. And so he starts talking and he says, well, first of all, brainwaves follow Fibonacci scaling. Mm-hmm. And I'm arguing with him because you have the center frequency of delta to the center frequency of theta. You do not get the center frequency of delta. But before I could go very far with my internal argument, he dispelled it by educating me that delta is not a monolith. There's actually 2 different deltas. They have different generators in the brain. There's low delta and there's high delta, and they're different. And if you add the center frequency of low and high delta, you get the center frequency of theta. Then you take the center frequency high delta theta, you get alpha, and so on all the way up the line. And so it does follow Fibonacci scaling, which is important because the ratios of any 2 adjacent Fibonacci numbers, other than the 0 and the 1 and the 2 right at the beginning, the founding numbers, they're always irrational. And that helps the torus resist mode locking at the border of chaos, so the halo can be stable over time. And so when he drew the math, it was working with a monkey brain, 4 hertz coherent, and then make a circle with a radius 4 or 5. And then you take double that, it's 8 or 10, and take that circle and rotate that, you sweep out a volume called a torus. And it was in the next to the last row in this audience of maybe 2,500 people. And I never before or since done this. I leaped out of my seat, shouted at the top of my lungs, because the stage was a long ways away, I've got 2 people in my database that show that pattern. One was a Zen master and the other got transmission when the Zen master died. Well, Dr. Mandel was most gracious, and his talk ended, lunch bell rang, everybody left for lunch. When I put my first foot on the stage, he said, "You must be a physicist and a psychologist." I go, well, yeah, how do you know that? He said, "Only somebody with those two disciplines could possibly have this data." Well, there were other people in the audience who subsequently invited me to a week at a CIA safe house in Savannah, Georgia. And I had the opportunity to sit in on some very cool conversation, as well as to share with them. They were freaking out. Oh my God, somebody who's not done some security clearance knows this stuff about brainwaves. And so it was interesting. Terry, the Frenchman, Delta training. What he did, remember, he's incredibly ethical. What he did was, in his mind, he went out into the world and he saw bad people living in darkness and doing dirty, dark deeds. Well, he noticed that we all have light within us. It's not our light, it's the light. But he noticed that these bad people could not see their own light. So he tweaked the frequency of their light a little bit so they could now see their light. Doesn't compel them to do anything, just now they can see their own light. So here you have, a fat drug dealer in Mexico waddling down an alley on his way to give an order to have 13 Mexican policemen beheaded because they're interfering with his operation. And a little kitty runs out from beside a rain barrel. And if he doesn't alter his stride, he's going to crush the kitty to death. He's fat, he's waddling. If he does alter his stride, spare the kitty's life, different outcome. If he kills the kitty, he now sees his light dim. If he makes no effort, saves the kitty's life, he sees his light brighten. So what Terry did, without interfering with their free will, he gave them feedback on the consequences, the moral and ethical consequences of their actions, which I thought was brilliant. He went right up to the line and did absolutely as much as he could to let them see their light and see the consequences of their actions on their own light. And so Delta can be used to alter. Now, if you're talking about a physical thing, no, you want to stop a war, just cause the bullets not to fire, or the armored personnel carriers and the tanks' engines not to run. I mean, that's totally ethical within a Delta perspective. But you must not, and you cannot, conserve the light, interfere with other people's free will. Can't make them be good. Or if you do, you're doing evil to change their intention.
Wow. My last question. What do we know about gamma, and when will we be more able to accurately measure it? From the stuff that you think you know from the last few years of research, what is gamma telling us?
Well, the classic gamma study was done by a group from Harvard that included Richard J. Davidson, who worked with a group of 8 Buddhist meditators who had between 10,000 hours and 50,000 hours each of the Buddhist compassion meditation. And he measured their brainwaves. Now, to measure gamma accurately, see, gamma totally overlaps with the muscle spectrum. And muscles are measured in millivolts, brainwaves, gamma's tiny brainwaves measured in microvolts. 1,000 or 10,000 times bigger is a tiny little twitch of a muscle in your cheek. So what Richard and his group did, and by the way, Richard has continued his work in a well-funded lab, I think it's in Wisconsin, and what he does is he pastes scores of muscle detecting electrodes, people's face, down the neck, and whatever. And if there's any muscle activity in any one of those muscle electrodes, he throws away the brainwaves, because any quote gamma would in fact be contaminated, overridden by the huge contribution, 1,000 times or 10,000 times bigger than the brain's gamma. So you can only accurately measure gamma if you carefully exclude all time periods where there's even the tiniest subliminal twitch of a muscle. And that could include an eye blink flutter. And so what they found with this careful procedure was that in these Buddhist meditators with 10,000 to 50,000 hours of Buddhist compassion meditation, the biggest gamma waves that had ever been recorded in an intact, healthy human brain. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, so when does gamma emerge? Well, let's say that you are a duck hunter and you built a blind near a pond. And so you go through the forest, disturbing the forest, and the forest shuts down, the birds don't tweet and the squirrels don't move, and you have to sit there maybe a half an hour motionless in the blind before the forest comes back to life. So then when the ducks come over, if you've been there stationary for a while, maybe the ducks will land and you can have duck soup for dinner. And so in the same way, before the gamma comes out to play, you have to be very, very still. Your alpha has to be big and strong and bountiful. And then the gamma comes out and it plays over the top of alpha. Now that's a sort of a personalization of, we could even make a little cartoon. You know, the alpha's strong and then the little gammas come out and they play.
Come into play.
Yes, coming to play. And so it is challenging to do, I mean, because all you'd have to do is have a subliminal muscle tension in your left cheek and gamma would light up in the left side of your head.
Dr. Hardt, congratulations on the second Global Consciousness Summit. I'm excited for all these conscious leaders to come together for the 2 days.
Well, I hope you'll be there talking.
Of course.
I want to like sort of invite you now to say more about your own personal experience of what you now know to be your delta in action. First of all, could you say if you have any experiential correlates, what does it feel like? How do you know when it's happening? And then what have you observed happen around you as a result? More, please.
It's a great question. Because for me to land into what I know from the brainwaves that I've done at Biocybernaut is, it's in a constant state of 5 to 10,000, whatever that means. And then when I consciously go into a delta state, it's a slowing down and it drifts slowly, slowly to the bottom of the ocean. It's very deep. And then sometimes I go from the bottom of the ocean into a universe full of stars. So I go all the way to the bottom and then I go, and I know visually what it looks like because I'm literally flying through a universe. It's incredible. I have this ability where I thought it was when I became a Reiki master, but I have this ability to be able to manifest, as you described from John and Terry, just to be able to bringing humanity to business and force the book. I want people to step into the light to do better. But over the years, what you've said really resonates around, you can't force anybody to do so. What you can do is illuminate possibilities for people. And I find that when I go into the delta state, I'm able to illuminate those possibilities or bring more of my light. And then whatever people choose to do, I have to surrender.
I have an invitation for you. I've been called, guided, to put together a group of people nicknamed Delta Force. These would be people who are Delta capable. And in the vision that I'm shown, somewhere near a dozen come into a room in the morning, sit around a oval table and get their electrodes on and go off to individual chambers to work on advanced things that I'm not ready to release to the general public yet. Individually might be doing different things. Then they come back, have a light lunch, and what are passed out are wish lists that come from people, individuals. It could come from organizations, could come from cities, nations, requesting. Maybe there's a locust plague that's eating up all the crops in an African nation. And so the group decides which one they're going to work on. And then they discuss how to do it in an ethical way, where it's totally ethical to alter events or things, but not ethical to alter people's intentions. And then they go to chambers and they do shared delta feedback. And we know that the power of the intention scales as a power function of the number of people who get on the same wavelength.
Wow.
Okay. And I've seen this with Alpha. And so the guidance is to create this group. Well, as you understand, picked up hints here and there, that there are, shall we say, compelling reasons to have some ethical interventions. And in fact, I've been asked recently by one of our Diamond Dozen members whether or not it's a good time to convene the Delta capable people to avert some of the catastrophes that are unfolding.
I would love to, and I'm smiling because the first time I flew to Bavaria to do the training, I didn't know anything about brainwaves, but I was offered a coaster with my drink on board, and I kept it in my pocket. And after a couple of days of the training, I pulled it out, and I had scribbled on this small coaster about 30 or 40 times the words Delta Force. Hopefully, more restrictions are lifted and we can get to catch up again in person.
Yes, very important.
Great. Dr. Hardt, thank you for your gifts to humanity and for the Consciousness Summit.
Well, thank you for your co-creation thereof.